There is a specific kind of silence that only exists at 30 degrees below zero. It isn't just the absence of noise. It is a physical weight. A heavy, suffocating blanket that presses against your eardrums until you can hear the blood rushing through your own veins. Up here in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska, the silence is the only neighbor I have. My name is Silas, and for the last 6 months, I have been the sole occupant of Outpost Zero-4, a glorified tin can perched on a granite ridge overlooking a valley of eternal ice. Most people think of weather stations as these quaint little cabins where guys with beards sip cocoa and look at thermometers. Outpost Zero-4 isn't that. It looks more like a lunar lander that crashed into the side of a mountain. It is a sterile, metallic blister reinforced with 3 inches of steel and anchored into the permafrost with titanium rods. My job is to monitor the polar cell, the massive system of high pressure that sits over the Arctic cap, and send data back to a supercomputer in Anchorage. It is boring, monotonous, and lonely work. And that is exactly why I took the contract. I didn't want to talk to people. I didn't want to deal with traffic or rent or the endless noise of the lower 48. I wanted the white silence, but the silence I woke up to this morning was different. It felt expectant. I started my shift at 0600 hours, though time is a relative concept during the polar night. The sun hadn't risen in 2 months, and it wouldn't rise for another one. Outside, the world was a canvas of deep, bruised blues and blacks, illuminated only by the faint, sickly glow of the aurora borealis dancing above the peaks. I poured my 3rd cup of black coffee, the sludge at the bottom of the pot, and sat down in front of the primary console. The main room of the station is dominated by a wall of monitors. On the left, satellite feeds from the NOAA network. In the center, the local Doppler radar. On the right, a scrolling feed of raw telemetry, wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, and dew point. Everything was green, normal, nominal. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and leaned back, stretching my legs. The heating vents hummed their rhythmic, comforting song. I was about to open my book-a-dense history of the Franklin expedition when the first anomaly appeared. It didn't start with a bang or a siren. It started with a single number on the pressure gauge. Barometric pressure is the heartbeat of the atmosphere. At sea level, standard pressure is around 1243 millibars. Up here, at elevation, it sits a little lower. When a storm is coming, the pressure drops. A drop of 20 millibars in 24 hours is considered bombogenesis, a massive, dangerous storm. I watched the digital readout flicker. 1002 millibars. I blinked. That was a slight drop, but nothing concerning. Probably a localized pressure pocket moving over the ridge. I looked away to log the temperature -34 Fahrenheit, and when I looked back, the number had changed again. 985 millibars. I frowned, setting my mug down on the metal desk with a dull clink. That wasn't right. A 17 millibar drop in less than 10 seconds was impossible. That wasn't weather. That was an equipment malfunction. The external sensors were likely iced over. It happens sometimes. The heating elements in the anemometer or the barometer housing would fail. Ice would build up, and the data would go haywire. Piece of junk, I muttered, grabbing my headset to toggle the diagnostic cycle. Come on, reset. I typed in the command code to reboot the external sensor array. The screens flickered black for a heartbeat, then illuminated with the reboot sequence. System restarting. Sensors calibrating. I waited, tapping my fingers on the armrest. I expected the number to bounce back to a healthy 1000 range. The screen flashed green. 940 millibars. My stomach did a slow, uneasy roll. 940 was the pressure you'd find in a Category 3 hurricane. But I wasn't in the tropics. I was in the middle of a frozen desert, and there was no wind. I looked at the anemometer readout. Wind speed, 3 knots. Direction, north-northwest. That's not possible, I whispered to the empty room. I stood up and walked over to the reinforced porthole on the north wall. I unlocked the heavy iron shutter and cranked it open. The glass was triple-paned, designed to withstand polar bears and avalanches. I pressed my face close to the cold surface. It was dead calm. The snow on the ground was undisturbed. The stars overhead were crisp and sharp, burning like diamond dust against the void. There were no clouds, no swirling vortex of doom, just a serene, indifferent night. I walked back to the console, convinced that the computer was frying itself. But then, the Doppler radar swept its arm across the screen. The radar map covers a radius of 400 miles. Usually it shows the scattered blue fuzz of light snow or the green bands of approaching fronts. The sweep line rotated clockwise. Tick, 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 tick. It hit the northern sector, the area over the Beaufort Sea, about 200 miles north of my position. A solid black blotch appeared on the screen. It wasn't a spiral. Storm spiral. They have arms, they have rotation. This was a perfect geometric circle of density. It had appeared instantly, between one radar sweep and the next. 1 second, the sea was clear. The next, something the size of Rhode Island was sitting there, and it was moving. I sat down hard in my chair, my eyes glued to the screen. Weather systems in this part of the world move west to east, driven by the jet stream. Sometimes they meander north or south. This mass was moving due south, straight toward the Brooks Range, straight toward me, and it was fast. Anchorage control, this is Outpost Zero-4, do you copy? I keyed the mic, my voice sounding tinny and small in the enclosed space. Static. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, pulsed through the speakers. Anchorage, this is Silas. I am reading a catastrophic pressure drop. Sensor malfunction suspected, but Doppler is confirming a mass inbound from the Beaufort Sea. Please advise. Over? The static hissed, rising and falling in pitch. It almost sounded like breathing. I stared at the pressure gauge again. 910 millibars. That kind of pressure drop shouldn't just be a number on a screen. If the air pressure outside was truly that low, my ears should be popping. The station's structure should be groaning as the pressure differential between the inside and outside fought for equilibrium. As if on cue, the metal floor beneath my boots gave a sharp, agonizing creak. The sound echoed through the station like a gunshot. I jumped, spinning around to look at the airlock door. The heavy steel wheel on the door remained sealed, but the walls were flexing. It was subtle, but I could see it. The steel plating was bowing outward ever so slightly. The air inside the station was pushing out, trying to fill the vacuum that was forming outside. I scrambled to the manual instrument cluster mounted on the wall, old-school analog needles that didn't rely on software. I tapped the glass of the barometer. The needle was buried in the red, pinned against the stop pin at the bottom of the dial. It wasn't a glitch. The sensors weren't frozen. The atmosphere outside was collapsing. I looked back at the Doppler. The black circle had grown. It was eating the map. And the strangest thing wasn't the size, or the speed, or the pressure. It was the color. Radar maps are color-coded. Green for light precipitation, yellow for moderate, red for heavy, purple for hail or extreme turbulence. The core of this thing was registering as white. White on a radar map means no return. It usually means the signal is being blocked by something so dense that the radio waves can't bounce back. It's what you see when you point a radar at a solid mountain. But there were no mountains in the Beaufort Sea. I grabbed my parka from the hook. I needed to go up to the observation deck, the external catwalk on the roof. I needed to see this with my own eyes. I needed to verify that the sky wasn't actually falling. I zipped the heavy coat up to my chin, pulled on my thermal gloves, and grabbed the flare gun from the emergency locker. Not because I thought I could shoot a storm, but because the primitive part of my brain, the lizard brain that was suddenly screaming in terror, wanted a weapon. I cycled the airlock. The hiss of the decompression was violent, the air rushing out of the room to feed the hungry void outside. The outer door groaned as I pushed it open. I stepped out onto the metal grating of the catwalk. The cold didn't hit me. That was the first thing I noticed. It should have been -30. It should have bent the exposed skin of my cheeks instantly. But the air was warm. It was a sickly, humid warmth, like the breath of a feverish animal. It smelled wrong. It didn't smell like ozone or snow. It smelled like copper and wet fur. I looked north. The horizon was gone. The stars were gone. A wall was approaching. It stretched from the ground to the zenith of the sky, a towering, undulating curtain of not clouds. It looked like smoke. Thick, oily, violet smoke that churned and boiled in silence. It was eating the landscape. The peaks of the mountains 10 miles away were there 1 second, and then they were simply erased, swallowed by the wall. And it was completely silent. No wind, no thunder. Just the visual horror of a tsunami of violet fog rushing toward me at impossible speeds. I raised my binoculars to my eyes, my hands trembling. I focused on the leading edge of the storm. The clouds weren't water vapor. They were moving with purpose. They were swirling in patterns that looked almost biological, like the intricate weaving of muscle fibers. Then the pressure hit me. It wasn't a gradual descent. It was a hammer blow. My ears popped painfully. Once, twice. I gasped, feeling the air being sucked out of my lungs. I dropped to one knee on the grating, clutching my chest. The world tilted. The digital watch on my wrist beeped the hour. The sun wasn't supposed to rise for another month. But as I looked up at the towering violet wall, a light began to bleed through the center of the mass. It wasn't sunlight. It was a pale, sickly green phosphorescence. And then, for the first time, the silence broke. It wasn't the wind. From the depth of the approaching wall, a sound erupted. It was a low, resonant thrum, like a cello bow being dragged across a rusted steel cable. It vibrated in my teeth. It vibrated in the marrow of my bones. I scrambled backward, crab-walking toward the airlock, my eyes locked on the impossible storm. The anemometer on the roof above me, which had been still a moment ago, suddenly spun so fast it shattered. The plastic cups flew off, shrapnel pinging against my helmet. The wind had arrived, and it wasn't blowing air. It felt like it was blowing gravity. I threw myself into the airlock and spun the wheel shut, locking out the violet sky just as the first wave of the anomaly slammed into the station. The entire building lurched, the steel groaning in protest. I was safe inside, or so I thought. But as I collapsed onto the floor of the airlock, gasping for breath, I looked at the inner door window. The condensation on the glass wasn't clear. It was red. I wiped it with my glove. It was rust-colored dust, seeping through the seals. The storm was getting in. I stared at the coffee mug in disbelief. The liquid wasn't just rippling from a vibration. It was boiling. Bubbles frothed at the surface, releasing plumes of bitter steam, yet the mug was stone cold to the touch. I yanked my hand away as if I'd been burned, the sudden movement sending sloshes of dark liquid onto the metal floor. It sizzled upon contact with the linoleum, like acid eating through plastic. "This isn't possible," I whispered. My voice sounded thin, reedy, swallowed by the sudden oppressive density of the air. I scrambled back to the primary sensor array. The internal temperature gauge for the station was climbing. It had been a comfortable 68 degrees a minute ago. Now it read 85, 90. It was skyrocketing, but I wasn't sweating. In fact, I was shivering uncontrollably. The air felt thick and humid, like a tropical jungle, but my skin registered a biting, stinging cold. It was a sensory contradiction that made my brain reel, unable to process whether I was freezing or burning. The humidity in the room was so high that condensation began to form on the computer monitors. Water droplets trickled down the screens like tears, distorting the erratic data readouts. I wiped a sleeve across the glass, trying to get a clear view of the external cameras. Camera 1 North Ridge, static. Camera 2 East Helipad, obscured. Camera 3 Main Catwalk, operational. I brought Camera 3 to the main monitor. The floodlights mounted on the tower illuminated the metal grating of the catwalk and the immediate area around the station. The snow, if you could even call it that anymore, was piling up fast. But the color was all wrong. Under the harsh halogen lights, snow should be brilliant white or gray. This stuff was a bruised, sickly violet green. It looked like the sky itself had been infected and was shedding its dying skin. Then the taste hit me. It started at the back of my throat, a sharp, metallic tang. It tasted like I was chewing on aluminum foil or sucking on a handful of old pennies. I gagged, spitting into the trash can, but the taste wasn't in my mouth. It was in the air. The station's filtration system should have scrubbed anything out, but the air reeked of ozone and electrified copper. I had to check the intake valves. If the vents were blocked by the strange precipitation, the Code 2 scrubbers would fail, and I'd suffocate within hours. I grabbed my parka, pulled on my thermal gloves, and grabbed the heavy wrench from the tool rack. I cycled the airlock. The inner door hissed shut behind me, plunging me into the small transition chamber. The air quality warning light was flashing yellow. I ignored it and punched the button for the outer door. The wind didn't hit me. That was the first shock. The anemometer inside said the wind speed was 180 miles per hour, which should have ripped the door from its hinges and pinned me to the wall. Instead, the air outside was dead still, not a breath of wind. The reading was a lie, or the wind was moving around the station, creating a perfect, horrifying vacuum. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The silence was absolute. No wind. No generator hum. Just the sound of my own boots crunching on the metal grating. I looked down at my feet. The violet-green slush wasn't melting. It was pulsating. Tiny, microscopic throbs like a heartbeat. I crouched down, shining my flashlight on the accumulation. It had a texture closer to gelatin than ice. A sound made me jerk my head up. A wet, heavy slap against the metal railing. Then another. Thwack, thwack, crunch. Birds, dozens of them. Arctic terns, snowy owls, ptarmigans. They were falling out of the sky. But they weren't just falling. They were frozen mid-flight. Their wings were extended, their eyes wide open, perfectly preserved statues of ice plummeting from the void above. They shattered when they hit the catwalk, exploding into shards of feathers and frozen meat. I backed away, shielding my face as a raven smashed into the railing inches from my hand, its beak snapping off like an icicle. It was raining death. The sky was purging itself of life. I looked up, and I wished to God I hadn't. The clouds weren't clouds. They were low, churning masses of that same sickly violet bioluminescence I had seen on the ground. They swirled in geometric patterns, perfect hexagons and fractals that nature simply does not produce. And amidst the swirling chaos, I saw arcs of green lightning, not striking down, but striking across, connecting the clouds like neurons firing in a massive, diseased brain. The metallic taste intensified until my gums started to bleed. I spat blood onto the snow, watching the red stain the violet slush. The slush recoiled. It pulled away from the blood, sizzling, as if my biology was toxic to it, or maybe it was just hungry. I scrambled for the manual release of the intake vents, needing to close them manually before this toxic sludge got into the life support system. The wheel was frozen solid. I hammered it with the wrench, chipping away the violet ice. Clang, clang, clang. The sound echoed, too loud in the unnatural stillness. Finally, the wheel gave way. I spun it, hearing the satisfying thud of the internal dampers closing. Safe, I breathed, though I didn't believe it. As I turned to head back to the airlock, the wind returned. But it didn't ramp up. It arrived instantly. 1 second, dead calm. The next, a wall of force hit me in the chest. It wasn't just wind. It carried a sound. Not the howl of a gale, but a voice. A distinct, articulated whisper that seemed to be coming from right next to my ear, despite the roar of the storm. "Let us in, Silas. It's warm inside." I froze, gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white inside my gloves. The voice sounded exactly like my own. I didn't wait to hear more. I threw myself at the airlock door, punching the code with trembling fingers. The hydraulic seal hissed, and I tumbled into the transition chamber, slamming the button to close the outer door. I sat on the floor of the airlock, gasping for breath. the metallic taste still coating my tongue. The inner door cycled open, letting the warm air of the station wash over me. I stood up, ripping off my hood. The monitors in the control room were all black now, every single screen, except for one. The central communication terminal was glowing with a single line of green text, blinking in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Signal received, origin unknown, and below it, the frequency dial was turning itself. The frequency dial on the radio console turned with a slow, deliberate mechanical grind. Click, click, click. It was moving by itself, guided by unseen fingers. I watched, paralyzed, as the needle swept past the emergency bands, past the maritime channels, and settled into the dead zone, the static-filled white noise between stations that we usually ignore. But there was no static. The speakers crackled, a sharp pop that made me jump, followed by a hum. It wasn't the hum of electricity, it was organic. It sounded like air moving through wet pipes or breath passing through a throat full of fluid. "Anchorage?" I croaked, grabbing the handset, my voice barely a whisper. "Anchorage, this is 04. Anchorage, this is 04. I have an intruder event. Over." Silence. Then the hum deepened. Not Anchorage, Silas. The voice coming from the speaker was mine. It had my cadence, my inflection, even the slight rasp I get when I'm dehydrated. But the tone was wrong. It was flat, devoid of emotion, like an A learning to speak by mimicking a recording. I dropped the handset. It clattered against the console, dangling by its coiled cord. "Who is this? How are you on this frequency?" "We are on all frequencies," the voice replied, overlapping with itself slightly, as if two versions of me were speaking in unison. "The air is thin, Silas. The barrier is brittle. We can taste your fear. It tastes like copper." I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the coffee I had spilled earlier. "This is a hallucination," I muttered, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes until sparks exploded in my vision. "Nitrogen narcosis. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The vents. I sealed the vents, but maybe." I looked at the CO2 sensors on the wall. They were green. The air mix was perfect. This wasn't a delusion brought on by bad air. This was happening. I grabbed the emergency sat phone from its wall mount. It was a rugged, brick-like device meant to connect directly to the Iridium satellite network. It was the fail-safe, the end-of-the-world phone. I extended the antenna and dialed the emergency evac number. No dial tone. No connection noise. Just that same wet, breathing hum. "There are no satellites, Silas," the voice on the radio said, anticipating my move. "The sky is closed. We have wrapped it in a shroud. You are in the cocoon now." "What do you want?" I yelled, my fear turning into a jagged, desperate anger. I threw the sat phone across the room. It smashed against the far bulkhead, cracking the plastic casing. "We want to come in. The pressure is equalizing. Can't you feel it?" I could. My ears popped painfully, then popped again. The pressure in the room was dropping to match the insanity outside. The heavy steel walls of the station groaned, the rivets pinging as they were stretched to their limits. The structure was designed to withstand Arctic gales, not a vacuum. I ran to the window. The blast shutters were down, blocking the view, but I could hear what was happening on the other side. The wind had changed pitch. It was no longer a whistle or a roar. It was a scream. It sounded like thousands of people screaming in unison. A choir of agony layered over a deep, mechanical grinding noise that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. It was the sound of the glacier moving, the sound of the mountains being ground into dust. I looked back at the radio. The frequency display was now scrolling numbers rapidly. Not coordinates, not frequencies. They were dates. 1947, 1959, 1982, 2024. It stopped on today's date. Then a new sound cut through the screaming wind. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct heavy raps. They didn't come from the door. They came from the heavy blast shutter covering the north window. I stopped breathing. That shutter was on the outside of the glass. It was 30 feet off the ground, overlooking a sheer drop down the ridge. There was no catwalk there, no ladder, just empty air and a 100-foot fall into the jagged rocks below. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. The steel plate vibrated with the force of the blows. Something was hovering outside the window, suspended in the violent storm, asking to be let in. I backed away until my spine hit the server racks. "Go away!" I screamed like a child terrified of the dark. The radio crackled again. "Open the shutter, Silas. We want to show you the new world. It's beautiful. The colors are so much brighter." "No, Silas." The voice dropped an octave, becoming guttural and distorted. "Look at the camera." My eyes darted to the bank of monitors. I had thought they were all dead, blacked out by the storm, but one screen flickered to life. Camera 4. It was the camera mounted directly above the north window, the one looking down at the shutter I was staring at. The image was grainy, distorted by interference and the violent violet snow, but I could see the shutter, and I could see what was knocking. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a bear. It was a limb. A long translucent appendage that looked like spun glass or solidified smoke. It extended from the storm, reaching out of the swirling chaos. At the end of it, where a hand should be, there were branching fractals, like the roots of a tree, tapping gently against the metal. And behind it, in the storm, I saw a face. It was massive. It filled the entire field of view of the camera. It was composed of the clouds themselves, shifting and roiling, but the eyes were distinct. Two hollow voids of darker violet staring directly into the camera lens. It knew I was watching. The limb on the screen pulled back, mimicking a winding motion. "Scree, Seech!" The metal of the shutter began to peel back. It wasn't being pried open. It was being unzipped at a molecular level. The steel curled outward, like a burning piece of paper. Behind the steel was the reinforced glass, and behind the glass was the storm. And the face, the radio voice laughed a dry, rasping sound that made my skin crawl. "The glass is just sand, Silas. Sand and fire. It remembers being fluid. We can remind it." The glass began to vibrate. A high-pitched resonance filled the room, drilling into my teeth. I clamped my hands over my ears, falling to my knees as a trickle of warm blood ran from my nose. The window was liquefying. The resonance was a physical assault. It wasn't just sound. It was a frequency that seemed to vibrate the water in my cells. My vision blurred, doubling and tripling the terrifying sight before me. The reinforced glass of the north window, 4 inches of polycarbonate and tempered silica designed to stop a polar bear at full charge, was rippling. It looked like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The center of the pane sagged inward, creating a concave bubble that pushed toward me. The reflection of the room, the blinking lights of the servers, the overturned coffee mug, my own terrified face stretched and distorted in the melting glass. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my boots finding no purchase on the slick floor. "System override," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Deploy secondary containment. Lockdown." Lockdown. The station's AI, usually a calm, synthesized female voice, responded with a garbled mess of noise. Lock, down, denied, system, reformatting, admin, privileges, revoked. The lights in the control room flared blindingly bright white, then died, plunging me into darkness. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then the emergency red auxiliary lights bathed the room in the color of blood. The sudden shift in lighting made the window look even worse. The violet storm outside was glowing, casting long, sickly shadows through the warping glass. The bubble in the window popped. It didn't shatter. There was no explosion of glass shards. It simply dissolved. The center of the pane evaporated into a mist of silica dust, leaving a hole the size of a dinner plate open to the storm. I braced myself for the decompression. I expected the air to be sucked out of my lungs, for the room to be instantly evacuated into the vacuum outside. I grabbed the leg of the heavy steel desk, preparing to hang on for my life. But nothing happened. No wind rushed out. No storm rushed in. The hole sat there, a perfect circle of impossible stillness. Then the intruder entered. It didn't climb through. It poured through. The substance I had seen on the camera, that translucent, glass-like smoke, slithered through the opening. It moved with purpose, expanding as soon as it entered the room. It coiled in the air, knitting itself together, gaining density and mass. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as the smoke solidified. It formed a torso, then legs, then arms. It was building a body right in front of me. It stood nearly 7 feet tall. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing a network of veins that pulsed with that same violet light. It had no hair, it had no clothes, and it had no face. Where a face should have been, there was just a smooth, blank surface of flesh. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. It stood perfectly still, looking at me with its eyeless visage. I fumbled for the flare gun in the emergency kit strapped to the side of the desk. My fingers shook so badly I almost dropped it. I ripped the Velcro strap open, the sound tearing through the silence like a gunshot. The figure didn't flinch. It tilted its head to the side, a bird-like, inquisitive movement. The radio crackled again, the voice now coming from every speaker in the room, surrounding me. "Do you like the vessel, Silas? We made it from memory. We are still learning the anatomy." "Stay back," I screamed, raising the orange plastic flare gun. "I swear to God, I'll burn you." The figure took a step. It didn't walk. It glided, its feet barely touching the floor. As it moved, the air around it distorted, shimmering like a heat haze. "Burn us?" the radio mocked. "We are the heat. We are the cold. We are the entropy." I pulled the trigger. The flare gun kicked in my hand. The magnesium round hissed through the air, a streak of blinding red fire. It hit the figure square in the chest. It should have embedded itself in flesh and burned at 2,000 degrees. It should have elicited a scream. Instead, the flare passed straight through the figure's chest as if it were made of water. The round slammed into the server bank behind it, exploding in a shower of sparks and melting plastic. Smoke filled the room instantly, the acrid smell of burning electronics mixing with the metallic copper stench of the entity. The figure looked down at the hole in its chest. The violet light swirled around the wound, and within seconds, the flesh knit itself back together. It looked up at me again. Then, a slit opened on the smooth surface of its face. A mouth. But it didn't open horizontally. It opened vertically, splitting the face from chin to forehead. Inside, there were no teeth. There was only a dark, swirling vortex of wind and snow. A sound came from that impossible mouth, not a voice, but a frequency. It was the same sound I had heard outside, the scream of thousands. I dropped the flare gun and turned to run. The only way out was the heavy blast door leading to the living quarters and the garage beyond. I sprinted for it, my lungs burning, the scream from the creature chasing me like a physical wave. I hit the door panel, slamming my hand onto the close button. The heavy steel door began to slide shut. The creature didn't run. It simply dissolved again, turning back into that violet smoke. It shot across the room faster than thought, streaming toward the closing gap in the door. Come on, come on, come on, I yelled, throwing my shoulder against the steel, trying to force it faster. The door slammed shut with a thunderous clang. The locking bolts engaged. Thud, thud, thud. I leaned against the cold metal, sliding down to the floor, gasping for air. I was safe. The blast door was rated for explosions. It was airtight. Nothing could get through that. I looked at the control panel next to the door. The indicator light was a solid, reassuring red. Locked. I closed my eyes, trying to slow my heart rate before it exploded in my chest. Click. My eyes snapped open. The light on the panel flickered. Click. It turned yellow. Transition. No, I whispered. No, that's manual override only. Click. The light turned green. Open. The hydraulic hiss of the door unsealing sounded like a snake waiting to strike. The heavy steel began to slide open. and standing in the gap, fully reformed, was the figure. But it had changed. It wasn't faceless anymore. It was wearing my face. It smiled, and the smile was too wide, stretching past where the jawbone should allow. "Hello, Silas," it said, using its own mouth this time. "It's time to go outside." The thing wearing my face stepped across the threshold. Its movements were fluid, devoid of the jerky hesitations of a human body fighting gravity. It was as if the air itself was carrying it. The smile, my smile, twisted into a rictus of predatory joy, didn't falter. I scrambled backward, crab walking away from the door until my back hit the cold lockers of the mudroom. There was nowhere left to go. The garage was behind me, but the keypad was on the other side of the room, past it. "What are you?" I choked out, the words feeling heavy and thick in my mouth. The entity stopped. It looked down at its own hands, my hands flexing the fingers, marveling at the articulation of the joints. "We are the silence that comes after," it said. Its voice wasn't coming from its throat. It was resonating directly in my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. "We are the space between the stars. We are the cold that burns." It took another step. As its foot touched the floor, the linoleum turned gray and brittle, cracking like dried mud. The corruption was spreading from its touch. Then the world stopped. The screaming wind outside cut out instantly. The deep mechanical grinding of the glacier ceased. Even the hum of the emergency lights died. We were in the eye. But this wasn't the calm center of a hurricane. In a normal storm, the eye is a respite, a circle of blue sky and gentle winds. This was absolute negation. My ears popped violently, a sharp pain stabbing into my eardrums. All sound vanished. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. It was total sonic deprivation. The air had become too thin or too wrong to carry sound waves. The entity seemed to grow in the silence. It pulsed with that violet light, brighter now against the sudden darkness. It gestured toward the small porthole window in the airlock door to the garage. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my primate brain told me to curl into a ball and close my eyes. But I couldn't look away. I was drawn to the window like a moth to a bug zapper. I pulled myself up and looked out. The landscape was gone. The brooks ranged the majestic, jagged peaks I had looked at every day for 11 months, had been erased. In their place was a writhing, shifting geometry of impossible shapes. Huge monolithic structures made of black obsidian twisted into the sky, spiraling in ways that made my eyes water. They weren't mountains. They were like vast, fossilized tentacles reaching for a sun that wasn't there. The sky wasn't black or violet anymore. It was a churning, bruised kaleidoscope of colors I didn't have names for. It looked like oil on water, but angry. And floating in that sky were things, colossal shapes, drifting like whales in a deep ocean. They were translucent, bioluminescent, trailing long filaments of light that swept across the alien terrain. They were beautiful. They were terrifying. I realized with a jolt of nausea that the station wasn't in Alaska anymore. We weren't on Earth. The storm hadn't just destroyed the outpost, it had transported it. Or maybe it had simply peeled back the layer of reality we call Earth to reveal what was underneath all along. The entity moved closer. In the silence, I felt its presence as a weight, a physical pressure on my chest. It reached out a hand to touch my face. I flinched, expecting pain, expecting death, but when its fingertip brushed my cheek, I didn't feel cold. I felt memories, a flash of a nebula being born, the death of a star, the sensation of drifting for 1 billion years in the dark, hungry and alone. It wasn't attacking me, it was sharing. The silence broke with the force of a thunderclap. Sound returned, amplified 1,000 times. The station shook violently, alarms blaring, metal shrieking. The eye was passing. The storm wall was hitting us again from the other side. The entity stumbled, its connection to this reality wavering. Its face, my face, rippled like water. For a second I saw the void beneath the skin again. It looked at me with an expression of sudden, desperate urgency. "The anchor is loose," it said, its voice sounding frantic now. "You must choose, Silas. Stay in the box and rot, or break the glass and become—" "Become what?" I screamed over the returning roar. "Infinite!" The wall of the mudroom, the one facing the storm, began to buckle. The steel plates bent inward, rivets popping like gunfire. The storm wanted in. The real storm. Not just the wind, but the entity swimming in that bruised sky. The creature wearing my face lunged at me. I thought it was attacking, but it shoved me. It pushed me hard, sending me skidding across the floor toward the garage access panel. "Run!" it roared, its face splitting apart completely now, revealing the swirling violet chaos beneath. "Run to the signal! We cannot hold the door forever." I didn't ask questions. I didn't look back. I punched the code into the garage door 1982, and the door slid open. I dove into the garage just as the mudroom wall collapsed. The sound of twisting metal and rushing wind was deafening. I hit the button to seal the garage door, watching through the narrowing gap. The entity stood in the wreckage of the mudroom, facing the storm. It spread its arms wide, embracing the chaos. As the violet snow engulfed it, it dissolved, becoming one with the wind. But before the door sealed, I saw one last thing. Beyond the collapsed wall, hovering in the air just outside the station, was one of the colossal, whale-like things I had seen in the sky. It was close enough to touch. Its giant, multifaceted eye rotated, fixing its gaze on me. Then the door slammed shut. Sealed. I was in the garage, safe, for now. But the garage wasn't insulated like the main station, it was freezing. And on the far wall the tracked snowcat vehicle sat waiting. I ran to it, praying the engine would turn over in this impossible cold. I climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. No, please," I begged, turning the key again. The radio and the snowcat crackled to life. Silas. It wasn't the entity this time. It wasn't the duplicated voice. It was a woman's voice, weak, distorted. "Silas, this is 05. Can you hear me? The sky is bleeding. 05, Gwen, she was 300 miles west. If she was seeing it too. This wasn't just here, it wasn't just me. This storm was everywhere. Gwen?" I snatched the radio mic from the dashboard, my breath pluming in the freezing cab of the snowcat. "Gwen, this is Silas. I copy. I hear you. What's your status?" Static hissed back at me, a jagged, wet sound, like raw meat being dragged across concrete. Then her voice cut through, faint and trembling. It's not snow, Silas. It's ash. Gray ash. It's covering everything. The generator is dead. The sun, it didn't come up. It's 10 a.m. and it's pitch black. My stomach dropped. Gwen, listen to me. Lock the doors. Do not look outside. Do not. They're inside, she whispered. The transmission cut to a high-pitched squeal that made me wince, followed by absolute silence. I dropped the mic. She was gone. Outpost Zero-5 was gone, and if the storm had reached her, 300 miles away, then this wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was a planetary event. I looked out the reinforced windshield of the snowcat. The garage was dark, lit only by the faint, dying glow of the emergency lights on the walls. But I could see the heavy bay doors that led outside. The metal was groaning, bending inward under the pressure. I tried the ignition one last time. Crank. Crank. Vroom. The diesel engine roared to life, vibrating the chassis. I didn't cheer. There was no joy left. Only a cold mechanical drive to survive for 5 more minutes. I engaged the gears and drove the snowcat forward, smashing through the weakened bay doors. The metal shrieked and crumpled, and then I was out. I was driving into the void. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a world I didn't recognize. The violet storm had passed, or perhaps we were in a lull. but the aftermath was worse. The snow wasn't white. Gwen was right, it was gray. A thick, suffocating layer of ash covered the landscape. It wasn't volcanic ash, it looked like fungal spores. The mountains were still wrong-twisted, alien geometries that defied physics. But the most terrifying thing was the sky. It was a bruised, stagnant purple, hanging so low it felt like I could reach up and touch it. And hanging in that sky were the shapes. Thousands of them. They were drifting south. Massive, bioluminescent leviathans, trailing tendrils of light, floating silently toward the populated zones, toward Fairbanks, toward Anchorage, toward the rest of the world. I drove. I didn't know where I was going. The GEPS was dead, displaying a frantic no signal message. I just drove south, following the slope of the land, hoping to find a road, a town, anything that still made sense. After an hour, the snowcat hit something. I slammed forward against the steering wheel, biting my tongue. I tasted blood warm and metallic, just like the air. I shook my head and looked out. I hadn't hit a rock. I hadn't hit a tree. I had hit a wall, but not a wall of stone or ice. It was a wall of static. It stretched from the ground up into the infinite darkness of the sky. It looked like the edge of a map in a video game that hadn't loaded yet. A sheer vertical plane of glitching, flickering reality. I put the snowcat in reverse, but the tracks just spun on the gray ash. I was stuck. I opened the door and stepped out. The cold was absolute. It didn't just freeze skin. It froze thought. I walked toward the wall of static. Up close, I could see images flashing in the noise. I saw cities burning. I saw oceans boiling. I saw people, millions of them, staring up at the sky with their mouths open, their eyes replaced by violet light. And then, the radio in my pocket, my handheld walkie chirped. Silas, it was the entity again, the one with my face. You cannot leave the sample jar, Silas. We aren't finished with the experiment. I turned around. The snowcat was gone. The tracks in the ash ended abruptly where I stood. In the distance, back toward the north, I saw a light. It was the Outpost Zero-4. It was glowing with a warm, inviting yellow light. It looked untouched, unharmed, and standing in the open doorway of the station, tiny in the distance, was a figure. It was me. I watched myself wave. A slow, friendly wave. Come back inside, Silas, the radio whispered. It's warm. The coffee is fresh, and the storm is just beginning. I looked at the wall of static. I looked at the alien sky, and I looked at the copy of myself waiting in the doorway of the only shelter left in the world. My skin was turning gray. I looked at my hand. The fingertips were starting to turn translucent. I could see the bones, and beneath the bones, the violet light pulsating. I wasn't the survivor. I wasn't the witness. I was the carrier. I raised the radio to my lips. My voice sounded strange, distorted, layered, like two people speaking at once. To anyone receiving this transmission, do not look at the sky. Do not trust the weather. And if you hear a knock at your window, do not open it. I dropped the radio into the gray ash. I didn't walk back to the station. I didn't walk into the wall. I sat down. I let the ash cover me. I let the cold enter me. And as my vision faded to violet, I felt the first beautiful, terrifying spark of the change. I am not Silas anymore. We are the storm.